Hello, everyone. My name is Aubrey Miller, and my research was mentored by Sarah Alonsi. My research topic was the effects of lyrical and instrumental music on stress. So, a little bit of reasoning behind why I decided to research this topic. I chose to investigate this topic as I've been a musician for the past 12 years of my life, playing several different instruments throughout my life. I love music and I'm very passionate about it. I also really enjoy listening to music, especially to help lessen stress while I'm studying for a test or preparing for a tennis match. I have found that by listening to music, I've been able to reduce my stress in a lot of situations that would have caused me anxiety otherwise. My own interest in psychology led me to wonder whether the instrumental music I'm used to playing or the lyrical music I listen to is truly better suited to reduce my stress, which is what led me to run this experiment and conduct this research on that topic. So, as a little bit of an introduction as to my research as a whole, music helps to lessen stress. But that being said, music is such a broad concept that the varying tempos, instruments, pitches, and genres would appear to have different impacts on stress. Many people choose instrumental music to reduce stress, but a few studies have shown that lyrical and instrumental music are equally efficient at reducing stress physiologically, which would prove that this notion that instrumental music is better at reducing stress to be false. That being said, some papers contradict this idea by showcasing the psychological stress difference between groups, showing that instrumental music is typically better at reducing psychological stress, even if there's no difference between physiological stress. I hope to discover how the choice of instrumental versus lyrical music can impact both perceived psychological and objective physiological stress levels. My hypothesis was that instrumental music would be better at reducing both types of stress, both psychological and physiological. I chose to run my experiment with a within subject design with the two groups of instrumental and lyrical music. I compared side by side with each person doing both the instrumental and lyrical groups, and it was randomized. So I flipped a coin to determine which type of music they would be listening to first. So, I'm going to begin by kind of defining what some of the important terms were in this experiment. And one of the most important ones is psychological stress. Psychological stress is when a particular environment in which a person finds themselves is deemed to be taxing or exceeding his or her resources and endangering his or her well being. So, overall, psychological stress is really when someone feels stress. They can kind of tell that they are stressed. It's more of a mental thing than an actual physical thing. Therefore, I measured it by using a visual analog scale survey so that each person could really just perceive the level of stress that they are at. And it is actually viewable on this slide to the right here. These are the questions that I asked. And there were 5 different questions. I feel on edge at present. I feel emotionally uncomfortable. I feel like my heart is pounding in my chest. My mind is racing right now. I have a lot of thoughts. And I feel fidgety right now. I need to walk around or move. And I requested participants to rate their severity on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being strongly disagree and 10 being most strongly agree. These ratings were then placed into a composite score of 50 for before and after each group, giving me 4 different markers for each composite score. The next term would be physiological stress. And a physiological response to stress affects the homeostatic state of a person via increases in heart rate and blood pressure. So, for example, if you're in the woods and confronted by a bear, you will need higher blood pressure and heart rate to give you resources to fight or flee. So, physiological response to stress is just that fight or flight instinct. Therefore, I measured it with HRV and BP. So, heart rate was calculated before and on a minute by minute status while the participant listened to music. And blood pressure was measured immediately before and after each group. So there were a lot more heart rate measurements than there was blood pressure. So this I had certain inclusion criteria for my experiment. One of that was that the participant is not hard of hearing. Since this experiment was so fully centered around music and listening to music was very important in it, I could not have someone who is leaning towards deafness just because it could skew results. In a similar manner, I had to make sure that each participant had no severe heart issues because if someone has heart issues, that could obviously impact the heart rate and blood pressure and skew my results. And this group was conducted on people who are relatively young, elementary school age, to adults, no one too old and too young to prevent that hard of hearing that I previously described. So, the first step for each person, and this whole entire experiment was conducted within my house in one certain room to make sure that the environment did not distract from the experiment. I had each participant start by completing a pre stress survey, the visual analog scale previously described. After this, I put on a smartwatch and it was on their left wrist for every participant, so that was very consistent. And I measured heart rate for exactly 5 minutes as a baseline measure. And this data was viewed firsthand on the watch, although I hid it from the participant so there would not be skewed results, but also additionally stored on my iPhone to use at a later computer time. I then took blood pressure for the beginning before I started to play music. And then I played 10 minutes of either instrumental or lyrical music, depending on which group they were randomly assigned to at the beginning. I measured heart rate every single minute during this time, and then I ensured that each person would complete the post-stress survey like directly after the time listening to period ended. And then after the stress survey, I took blood pressure. I then allowed each participant to have a 5-minute break just because I did not want the blood pressure and heart rate to be skewed. I wanted there to be a time for their levels to normalize before running the next group. I then recompleted steps 1 through 6 for the other group for each person. And they finally finished by filling out a final survey, including questions on their musical experience and preference. So, when it came to results, I obviously had heart rate, blood pressure, and visual analog scale. For heart rate, there's a significant difference between 4 different time points. This was at minutes 3, 6, 7, and 9. At these times, instrumental music was significantly more successful at reducing heart rate at these values, with mean heart rate values significantly below that of the lyrical group. And all of these times had a p-value of less than 0.05, marking that statistical significance previously mentioned. And at minutes 3, 6, 7, and 9, the mean heart rate values for instrumental were 67.2, 67.6, 67.2, and 68.1 beats per minute, respectively, compared to lyrical mean heart rate values of 69.8, 70.2, 70.6, and 70.3. That being said, the other time points of minutes equals 0, 1, 2, 4, 5, 8, and 10 had no significant difference whatsoever between group. Therefore, with fewer than half of the 10 timestamps showing significant difference, especially including the last timestamp of 10 minutes, there's not enough to show that either instrumental or lyrical music is more successful at reducing physiological stress. This trend continued with the blood pressure results. There was no statistical significance for neither systolic nor diastolic blood pressure pre or post experiment, with p-values far above the 0.05 marker. And this only further confirms that there is no trend on a physiological level between stress levels in instrumental music compared to lyrical music. My psychological stress results, however, were different. The visual analog scale did provide some level of statistical significance. It's important to note that there was no significant difference for the before surveys, but this was expected and hoped for since there should be no difference between conditions before the experiment begins. That being said, there was, however, a statistically significant difference between groups after the experiment with a p-value of 0.031. The instrumental music had a mean composite score of 7.7, while lyrical had a mean score of 8.9. And for these, we wanted the mean composite score to be lower to indicate that they had a lower level of stress. So the lower the composite score, the lower their stress, and the better it was at reducing stress. So therefore, instrumental music appears to be more successful at reducing psychological stress than lyrical music, which was an interesting finding and contrasts the physiological levels of stress that I saw with my blood pressure and heart rate values. So, to conclude, overall, there is no trend on a physiological level between stress levels in instrumental music compared to lyrical music. That being said, instrumental music appears to be more effective at decreasing psychological stress than lyrical music. I found that there were various strengths of my experiment and research as a whole. There were simultaneous viewing groups, and I also worked very hard to ensure that there was a comprehensive assessment of physiological and psychological stress. I worked hard to incorporate 3 different markers: the heart rate, blood pressure, and the visual analog scale. And I worked to come up with visual analog scales that encompassed all different aspects of psychological stress and ensured that there was no single faceted aspect to my survey. That being said, there were certain limitations to my experiment. There was a lack of diversity. I live in a primarily white area, and my own participants' subject pool really reflected the lack of diversity within my own area, although I did try my best to recruit a more diverse group of people. There also was somewhat of a lack of gender diversity, since the majority of people that were my participants were female. But as a strength, I did have diversity of age groups. The average age was roughly 38, but it encompassed people from ages 7 to 73. So I made sure to include a lot of different ages to kind of overcome some of the lack of diversity on a racial and gender-based level. That was also limited by song choice. For a 10-minute song that I chose, it was written by Taylor Swift, and the majority of people have strong feelings towards her, whether they are negative feelings or positive feelings. And really strong feelings towards music in general could cause an increase or reduction in stress, which could skew results. Also, another limitation was a brief or listening period. 10 minutes may seem like a long time to listen to a song, but when it comes to analyzing stress on a minute by minute level, every minute counts. If I was able to redo this experiment just with more time and on a more like time based with participants more willing to spend more time listening to music, I would probably have them listen to roughly 30 minutes of music or longer to really be able to analyze just exactly how deeply stress can be reduced through listening to different types of music. That was my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.